be a God, by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky.
Introduction, by Ken MacLeod. I first tried to read this book in 1977. The setting and ideas were fascinating, and I knew something of the author's renown. Within a few years I was to read their later and darker novels, Prisoners of Power and Roadside Picnic, with no difficulty and rapt attention. But in this first encounter, something in the texture of the prose, perhaps glitches in the translation, 1973, from Russian to English via German, knocked me back. I returned the novel unfinished to the library. No reader of this fine new translation will have that reaction. The story grips from start to finish, a smooth and fast gallop of colour, adventure, action, and intrigue. Set on a feudal planet entering, and a kingdom being violently held back from entering, its equivalent of the Renaissance, it was at first conceived as an exciting adventure story in the manner of the Three Musketeers, albeit with alien, i.e., in this case human, observers caught up in the caper. The beginnings of a reaction in the early 1960s against the post-Stalin Soviet thaw in cultural policy made the authors deepen and darken the tale, to present a strong and subtle argument about morality, politics, and history. Boris Strugatsky's afterword shows how suffocating the reaction was becoming, and what courage it took to struggle against it. The brothers Arkady, 1925 to 1991, and Boris, 1933 to 2012, Strugatsky, lived through all the major episodes in the life of the Soviet Union except the Revolution and the Civil War, and in the end outlived it. They were perhaps the Soviet SF writers best known in the West, and revered by readers in their homeland. Despite the hacking mutilations of repeated and heavy-handed censorship, their work persistently held bureaucracy, militarism, conformism, flattery, repression, and manipulation to a blistering fire of ridicule, satire, and critique. This may have been possible in part because it would have embarrassed even Brezhnev's censors to concede that such criticism might just possibly allude to the Soviet system, and in part too because the ideals upheld by the brothers, for society and for individual moral behaviour, were those that Soviet society literally inscribed upon its banners. Hard to be a God is one of their novels set in the Noon universe, which anticipates Star Trek and Ian M. Banks's culture novels by postulating a highly developed civilization without money, classes, toil, the state, or indeed any organized coercion. An association, as Marx put it, where the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Such a civilization was the proclaimed goal of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, whose 1961 program promised the people that they would reach its threshold by 1980. That prediction was dropped in 1986. As the Star Trek reference suggests, the prospect of a more or less communist utopian future was more widely shared in the mid-1960s, even among people hostile to or critical of the communist-ruled states, than we might now think. The Strugatsky brothers placed it in the 22nd century. Like the culture, but unlike the Federation of Star Trek, their utopia sometimes, not always as we'll see, intervenes to bring progress to backward planets. Progress being, of course, progress towards the communist utopia. And unlike either Banks or Roddenberry's, but like the Soviet Union, the Strugatsky's utopia has a theory of history to justify and guide its work. As the authors and their hero could both say, that's where their troubles begin. The theory is Marx's materialist conception of history. Its classic formulation opens as follows. In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation, on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. Marx, 1859. In the Noon universe, this famously fertile hypothesis has matured into a genuine science, basis theory. That theory's application to feudal society has been developed in quiet offices and laboratories, at dusty archaeological digs, in thoughtful discussions. Needless to say, this isn't how the theory of historical materialism has usually been developed and discussed. Suggesting that it might yet become what Thomas Kuhn called normal science is subtly subversive of both Soviet scholasticism and Western skepticism. But let that pass. The problem faced by the novel's hero Anton, whom we see most of the time in his native guise as the well-placed aristocrat Don Rumata, is twofold. The first is that he is on the backward planet and in the medieval kingdom of Arkana purely as an observer. Like his fellow secret watchers from Earth's Institute of Experimental History, he's forbidden to intervene more than marginally in the darkening scene around him. The circlet on his brow conceals a camera, covertly recording and transmitting data for the Institute's historical laboratories. The second is that the reality he's increasingly embroiled in contradicts the theory. He's watching in horror the growth of what looks very like fascism in a feudal society, which in terms of basis theory does not compute. Pondering the rise of the ineffectual king's sinister security minister Don Reba and his grey troopers, Rumata reflects, the monopolies had stood behind Hitler. No one was standing behind Don Reba. Reba's rule, it seems, has no material basis. No section of society benefits from it in the way that German big business had, on the communist view, benefited from fascism. Rumata's colleagues and comrades, good communards like himself, don't see it that way. They understand Reba not as an anachronistic, anomalous Hitler, but as a figure in the familiar late feudal stamp of Richelieu, or Henry VIII's chief minister Thomas Cromwell. A far-sighted, shrewd and ruthless politician defending the absolute monarchy against lawless, over-mighty barons, and thus, in the due course of centuries, clearing the path for capitalist and, later still, socialist enlightenment. In posing this problem, even, or perhaps especially in a work of popular fiction, the authors were poking wet fingers at live wires. In their first draft, they went so far as to call their villain Don Reba Rabia, a transparent anagram of Beria. Lavrenti Beria, 1899 to 1953, was the head of Soviet state security from 1939 until 1946, and was in powerful posts close to that ministry until his overthrow and execution. At the time Hard to Be a God was written, Beria was a byword for dark conspiracies and bloody deeds, as of course it remains, and also a public scapegoat for culpabilities more widely shared among those who had been in power in the Stalin era. By alluding to it, the brothers were dropping a broad hint indeed. The official line under Khrushchev was that terrible crimes had been committed on a massive scale, that these crimes had in no way benefited and in many ways seriously damaged the state, that they had served no discernible social interest, and that this world historical disaster was adequately explained by the whims of Stalin and the intrigues of Beria. Something very like fascism had, on the official account, ravaged a socialist society, in which fascism had no material basis, purely as a result of the personal character defects, Stalin, and downright depravity, Beria, of the men at the top. This was hard to square with the materialist conception of history, not to mention hard to swallow. The Strugatsky brothers paid the official line the unwelcome tribute of taking seriously the theoretical conundrum it posed. Their answer, and their heroes', was that any society falling short of the fully rational one dedicated to the free development of every individual within it is bound to nurture at least some warped individuals driven by envy and spite to enjoy destructive behavior for its own sake, and that nothing in basis theory rules out such individuals coming to power, and finding a ready supply of likewise warped characters to do their bidding. The task for the rational and moral person caught in such a situation is to do all they can to resist, regardless of what stage of history they find themselves struggling in. In writing and publishing Hard to Be a God, which, despite severe criticism from the literary lackeys of officialdom, remained in print and popular in Russia from that day to this, Arkady and Boris Strugatsky did exactly such a noble deed themselves, and encouraged countless others to do likewise. They also wrote a racy, pacey, engaging, and entertaining book, as readable as it is relevant, and as difficult to put down as it is to forget. Read it now. Ken MacLeod. The sorrow that tortured me, the shame that overwhelmed me, the desperation that racked my mind, all these I could then feel. But even now I can find no words to express them. Pierre Abelard. Now, one thing I have to tell you. In this particular show, you have to be armed to enforce your authority. But you're not to use your weapon under any circumstances. Under any circumstances. Is that quite clear? Ernest Hemingway. Prologue. The black stock of Anka's crossbow was made of plastic, while the strings were chrome steel, operated by a single motion of a noiselessly sliding lever. Anton didn't trust newfangled technology. He had an old-fashioned arbalist in the style of Marshal Tott's, King Pitts I, overlaid with black copper, with a cable of ox sinew wound around a little wheel. And Pashka had taken a pneumatic rifle. Since he was lazy and lacked the mechanical aptitude to work crossbows, he thought they were childish. They landed on the north shore, where the gnarled roots of the giant pines jutted out of the sandy yellow cliff. Anka let go of the rudder and looked around. The sun was already over the forest, and everything was blue, green, and yellow. The blue fog above the lake, the dark green pine trees, and the yellow shore on the other side. And the sky above it all was a pale, clear blue. "There's nothing there," Pashka said. The kids sat leaning over the side of the boat, looking into the water. "A huge pike," Anton said confidently. "With fins this big?" Pashka asked. Anton didn't reply. Anka also took a look, but saw only her own reflection. "Be good to take a swim," said Pashka, plunging his arm into the water up to his elbow. "It's cold," he reported. Anton clambered to the front and jumped onto the shore. The boat swayed. Anton grabbed its side and looked expectantly at Pashka. Then Pashka stood up, put the oar behind his neck like a yoke, and, wriggling his lower body, sang, "Grizzled sea dog Tarky Park, pal, you'd better stay awake. Careful, schools of deep-fried sharks rush towards you through the lake." Anton silently jerked the boat. "Hey, hey!" Pashka shouted, grabbing at the sides. "Why deep-fried?" Anka asked. "Dunno," answered Pashka. They climbed out of the boat. "Sounds good, huh? Schools of deep-fried sharks." They hauled the boat onto the shore. Their feet sank into the damp sand, full of dried needles and pine cones. The boat was heavy and slippery, but they managed to drag it out all the way to the stern, then stopped, breathing hard. "I'd crush my foot," said Pashka, fixing his red bandana. He always made sure that his bandana was tied precisely over his right ear, in the fashion of the hook-nosed Irukanian pirates. "Life ain't worth a dime," he declared. Anka was intently sucking on her finger. "A splinter?" Anton asked. "No, a scratch. One of you two has real claws. Let me have a look." She showed him. "Yes," said Anton. "A wound. Well, what should we do?" "Hoist the boat onto our shoulders and walk along the shore," Pashka suggested. "So why did we get out?" Anton asked. "Any idiot could manage in a boat," Pashka explained. "But on the shore there are reeds, that's one, cliffs, that's two, and ponds, that's three, and the ponds are full of carp and catfish." "Schools of deep-fried catfish," said Anton. "You ever dive into a pond?" "Sure. Never seen you do it. Must have missed it somehow. Lots of things you haven't seen." Anka turned her back to them, raised her crossbow and shot at a pine tree about 20 paces away. Bits of tree bark rained down. "Nice," said Pashka, and immediately fired his rifle. He had aimed at Anka's bolt, but he missed. "Didn't hold my breath," he explained. "And if you had?" asked Anton. He was looking at Anka. Anka pulled the bowstring lever. She had excellent muscles. Anton enjoyed watching the little hard ball of her biceps roll under her tanned skin. She took very careful aim and fired another bolt. It pierced the tree trunk right below the first with a crack. "We shouldn't be doing that," she said, lowering her crossbow. "Doing what?" Anton asked. "Hurting the tree, that's what. Some kid was shooting at a tree with a bow yesterday, so I made him pull the arrows out with his teeth." "Pashka," said Anton. "Go on, you have good teeth." "One of my teeth makes me whistle," he retorted. "Forget it," said Anka. "Let's do something." "I don't feel like climbing cliffs," Anton said. "Me neither. Let's go straight." "Go where?" Pashka asked. "Wherever." "Well," said Anton. "That means the Siver," Pashka said. "Let's go to the Forgotten Highway. Remember, Toshka?" "Of course," Anton replied. "You see, Anechka," Pashka began. "Don't you call me Anechka," Anka said sharply. She couldn't stand it when people called her anything other than Anka. Anton took careful note of her preference. He quickly said, "The Forgotten Highway. No one drives on it, and it's not on the map, and we have no idea where it goes." "And you've been there?" "Once, but we didn't have the time to explore." "A road from nowhere to nowhither," declared the recovered Pashka. "That's amazing," Anka said. Her eyes became like black slits. "Let's go. Will we make it by night?" "Come on, we'll make it by noon." They climbed up the cliff. When he got to the top, Pashka turned around. He saw the blue lake with the yellowish bald patches of the sandbars, the boat lying on the sand, and large ripples spreading in the calm, oily water by the shore. Probably a splash from that same pike. And Pashka was filled with the vague elation he always felt when he and Anton had run away from boarding school, and a day of total independence lay ahead, full of undiscovered places, wild strawberries, hot, deserted meadows, grey lizards, and ice-cold water from unexpected springs. And, as always, he wanted to whoop and leap up high in the air, and he immediately did so, and Anton looked at him, laughing, and Pashka saw that Anton's eyes expressed complete understanding. And Anka put 2 fingers in her mouth and gave a wild whistle, and they entered the forest. It was a forest of sparse pines. Their feet kept slipping on the fallen needles. The slanting rays of the sun fell between the straight trunks, and the ground was dappled with golden spots. It smelled of tar, the lake, and wild strawberries. Unseen birds screeched somewhere in the sky. Anka was walking in front, holding the crossbow underneath her arm, occasionally bending down to pick the blood-red wild strawberries, so shiny they looked varnished. Anton followed, with the good old-fashioned arbalist of Marshal Tots on his shoulder. The quiver, with the good old-fashioned bolts, slapped heavily against his behind. He walked and glanced at Anka's neck. Tanned, almost black, with protruding vertebrae. Once in a while he'd look around, searching for Pashka, but Pashka was nowhere to be found, except that from time to time, first to his right, then to his left, a red bandana would flash in the sun. Anton pictured Pashka silently gliding between the pine trees, his rifle at the ready, his thin, predatory face with the peeling nose stretched out in front of him. Pashka was stealing through the Saiva, and the Saiva meant business. The Saiva will call, my friend, and you have to respond in time, thought Anton. He was about to duck down, but Anka was in front of him, and she might turn around. It'd be ridiculous. Anka turned around and asked, "You left quietly?" Anton shrugged. "Who leaves loudly?" "Actually, I might have been noisy," Anka said anxiously. "I dropped a basin and suddenly there were footsteps in the hall. Must have been old maid Katya. She's on duty today. I had to jump into the flower bed." "What do you think, Toshka? What kind of flowers grow in there?" Anton furrowed his brow. "Underneath your window? No idea. Why?" "Very hardy flowers. No wind can bend them, no storm can fell them. People have jumped in there for years, but they couldn't care less." "That's interesting," Anton said with an air of deep thought. He remembered that underneath his window there was also a flower bed with flowers, "No wind can bend, no storm can fell," but he had never paid any attention. Anka stopped, waited for him, and offered him a handful of wild strawberries. Anton carefully took 3 berries. "Have some more," said Anka. "Thanks," said Anton. "I like taking them one by one. Old maid Katya isn't too bad, right?" "Depends on your point of view," said Anka. "When someone tells you every night that your feet are either dirty or dusty—" She stopped talking. It was wonderful walking alone in the forest with her like this, shoulder to shoulder, bare elbows touching, glancing over occasionally to take in how pretty she was, how agile and how amazingly friendly, how her eyes were big and grey with black eyelashes. "Yeah," said Anton, stretching out his hand to brush aside a cobweb that gleamed in the sun. "I bet her feet are never dusty. If you're carried over puddles, you sure won't get covered in dust." "Who's been carrying her?" "Henry from the weather station. You know, the big blonde one." "Really?" "What's the big deal? Everyone knows that they're in love." They stopped talking again. Anton took a look at Anka. Her eyes were like black slits. "Since when?" she asked. "Oh, one moonlit night," Anton answered cautiously. "Just don't tell anyone." Anka chuckled. "No one made you talk, Toshka," she said. "Want some wild strawberries?" Anton mechanically scooped berries from her stained little palm and stuffed them into his mouth. "I don't like gossips," he thought. "I can't stand blabbermouths." He suddenly found an argument. "You'll be carried in someone's arms yourself someday," he said. "How would you like it if people started gossiping about it?" "What makes you think I'm going to gossip?" Anka said, sounding distracted. "I don't like gossips myself." "Listen, what are you up to?" "Nothing in particular." Anka shrugged. A minute later she confided, "You know, I'm awfully sick of having to wash my feet twice every single night." Poor old maid Katya, thought Anton. A fate worse than the Saiva. They came out onto the trail. It sloped down, and the forest kept getting darker and darker. It was overgrown with ferns and tall, damp grass. The pine trunks were covered in moss and the foam of white lichen, but the Saiva meant business. A hoarse, utterly inhuman voice suddenly roared, "Stop! Drop your weapons, you noble Don and you Donya!" When the Saiva calls, you have to respond in time. In a single, precise motion, Anton knocked Anka into the ferns to the left, threw himself into the ferns to the right, then rolled over and lay in wait behind a rotten tree stump. The hoarse echo was still reverberating through the pine trunks, but the trail was already empty. There was silence. Anton, lying on his side, was spinning the little wheel to draw the bowstrings. A shot rang out, and some debris fell on him. The raspy, inhuman voice informed them, "The Don was struck in the heel." Anton moaned and grabbed his foot. "Not in that one. The other one," the voice corrected. You could hear Pashka giggle. Anton carefully peered out from behind the stump, but he couldn't see a thing in the thick green gloom. At this instant, there was a piercing whistle and a sound like a tree falling. "Ow!" Pashka gave a strangled cry. "Mercy! Mercy, don't kill me!" Anton immediately jumped up. Pashka was backing up out of the ferns toward him. His arms were above his head. They heard Anka's voice. "Anton, do you see him?" "I see him," Anton answered appreciatively. "Don't turn around," he yelled at Pashka. "Hands behind your head." Pashka obediently put his hands behind his head and announced, "I'll never talk." "What are we supposed to do with him, Toshka?" Anka asked. "You'll see," said Anton, and took a comfortable seat on the stump, resting his crossbow on his knees. "Your name!" he barked in the voice of Hector the Irukanian. Pashka expressed contempt and defiance with his back. Anton fired. A heavy bolt pierced the branch above Pashka's head with a crack. "Whoa!" said Anka. "My name is Bon Lukusta," Pashka admitted reluctantly. "And here, it seems, will he die. For I only am left, and they seek my life." "A well-known rapist and murderer," Anton explained. "But he does nothing for free. Who sent you?" "I was sent by Don Saturini the Ruthless," Pashka lied. Anton said scornfully, "This hand cut the thread of Don Saturini's foul life 2 years ago in the territory of heavy swords." "Should I stick a bolt in him?" offered Anka. "I completely forgot," Pashka said hastily. "Actually, I was sent by Arata the Beautiful. He promised me 100 gold pieces for your heads." Anton slapped his knees. "What a liar!" he exclaimed. "Like Arata would ever get involved with a villain like you." "Maybe I should stick a bolt in him after all?" Anka asked bloodthirstily. Anton laughed demonically. "By the way," said Pashka, "your right heel has been shot off. It's time for you to bleed to death." "No way!" Anton objected. "For one thing, I've been constantly chewing on white tree bark, and for another, 2 beautiful barbarians have already dressed my wounds." The ferns rustled, and Anka came out onto the trail. Her cheek was scratched, and her knees were smeared with dirt and grass. "It's time to dump him into the swamp," she announced. "When an enemy doesn't surrender, he's destroyed." Pashka lowered his arms. "You know, you don't play by the rules," he said to Anton. "You always make Hector seem like a good man." "A lot you know," said Anton, coming out onto the trail as well. "The Siver means business, you dirty mercenary." Anka gave Pashka back his rifle. "Do you always let loose at each other like that?" she asked enviously. "Of course," Pashka said in surprise. "What, are we supposed to yell boom, boom, bang, bang? The game needs an element of risk." Anton said nonchalantly, "For example, we often play William Tell." "We take turns," Pashka caught on. "One day the apple's on my head, the next day it's on his." Anka scrutinized them. "Oh, yeah?" she said slowly. "I'd like to see that." "We'd love to," Anton said slyly. "Too bad we don't have an apple." Pashka was grinning widely. Then Anka tore the pirate bandana off her head and quickly rolled it into a long bundle. "The apple is just a convention," she said. "Here's an excellent target. Go on, play William Tell." Anton took the red bundle and examined it carefully. He looked at Anka, Her eyes were like slits. And Pashka was enjoying himself. He was having fun. Anton handed him the bundle. "At 30 paces, I can manage to hit a card without fail," he recited evenly. "I mean, of course, with a pistol that I'm used to." "Really?" said Anka. She turned to Pashka. "And you, my dear, could you hit a card at 30 paces? Pashka was placing the bundle onto his head. "Some day we will try," he said, smirking. "In my time, I did not shoot badly." Anton turned around and walked down the trail, counting the steps out loud. 15, 16, 17. Pashka said something. Anton didn't catch it, and Anka laughed loudly. A little too loudly. 30, Anton said, and turned around. At 30 paces, Pashka looked incredibly small. The red triangle of the bundle was perched on top of his head like a dunce cap. Pashka was smirking. He was still playing around. Anton bent down and started slowly drawing the bowstrings. "Bless you, my father William," Pashka called out. "And thank you for everything, no matter what happens." Anton knocked the bolt and stood up. Pashka and Anka were looking at him. They were standing side by side. The trail was like a dark, damp corridor between tall green walls. Anton raised the crossbow. The weapon of Marshal Tots had become extraordinarily heavy. "My hands are shaking," thought Anton. "That's not good." He remembered how in the winter Pashka and he had spent a whole hour throwing snowballs at the cast-iron pine cone on the fence post. They threw from 20 paces, from 15, and from 10, but they just couldn't hit it. And then, when they were already bored and were leaving, Pashka carelessly, without looking, threw the last snowball and hit it. Anton pressed the stock of the crossbow into his shoulder with all his strength. "Anka is too close," he thought. He wanted to call her to step away, but realized that it'd be silly. Higher. Even higher. Higher still. He was suddenly seized with the certainty that even if he turned his back to them, the heavy bolt would still sink right into the bridge of Pashka's nose between his cheerful green eyes. He opened his eyes and looked at Pashka. Pashka was no longer grinning, and Anka was very slowly raising a hand with her fingers spread, and her face was tense and very grown up. Then Anton raised the crossbow even higher and pressed the trigger. He didn't see where the bolt went. "I missed," he said very loudly. Walking on unbending legs, he started down the trail. Pashka wiped his face with the red bundle, shook it, unfolded it, and started tying it around his head. Anka bent down and picked up her crossbow. If she hits me over the head with that thing, Anton thought, I'll thank her. But Anka didn't even look at him. She turned toward Pashka and asked, "Shall we go?" "1 second," Pashka said. He looked at Anton and silently tapped his forehead with a bent finger. "And you really got scared," Anton said. Pashka tapped his forehead with a finger again and followed Anka. Anton trudged behind them and tried to suppress his doubts. "What did I do wrong exactly?" he thought dully. "Why are they so mad? Well, Pashka, I understand, he got scared. Except I don't know who was more frightened, William the father or Tell the son. But what about Anka? She must have gotten scared for Pashka. But what could I have done? Look at me, trailing behind them like a cousin. I should just take off. I'll turn left here. There's an interesting swamp that direction. Maybe I'll catch an owl." But he didn't even slow down. That means it's for life, he thought. He had read that it very often happened like this. They came out onto the abandoned road even sooner than expected. The sun was high. It was hot. The pine needles prickled under Anton's collar. The road was concrete, made of 2 rows of cracked, greyish-red slabs. Thick, dry grass grew in the interstices. The side of the road was full of dusty burrs. Beetles were buzzing, and one of them insolently slammed right into Anton's forehead. It was quiet and languid. "Look," said Pashka. A round tin disc, covered with peeling paint, hung in the middle of a rusty wire stretched across the road. It seemed to show a yellow rectangle on a red background. "What is it?" Anka asked, without any particular interest. "A road sign," Pashka said. "Says not to go there. Do not enter," Anton confirmed. "Why is it here?" Anka asked. "It means you can't go that way," Pashka said. "So why the road?" Pashka shrugged his shoulders. "It's a very old highway," he said. "An anisotropic highway," declared Anton. Anka was standing with her back to him. "It only goes one way." "The wisdom of our forefathers," Pashka said pensively. "You drive and drive for 100 miles, then suddenly, boom, a do not enter sign. You can't go straight, but there's no one to ask for directions." "Imagine what could be beyond the sign," said Anka. She looked around. They were surrounded by many miles of empty forest, and there was no one to ask what could be beyond the sign. "What if it doesn't even say do not enter?" she asked. "The paint is mostly peeled off." Then Anton took careful aim and fired. It would have been fantastic if the bolt had shot through the wire and the sign had fallen at Anka's feet. But the bolt hit the top of the sign, piercing the rusty tin, and the only thing that fell was dried paint. "Idiot," said Anka without turning around. This was the first word she had addressed to Anton after the game of William Tell. Anton smiled crookedly. "And enterprises of great pitch and moment," he recited, "with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action." Good old Pashka shouted, "Guys, a car has driven this way since the thunderstorm. Here's the flattened grass, and here." Lucky Pashka, thought Anton. He started examining the marks on the road and also saw the flattened grass and the black stripe left by the treads when the car had braked before a pothole. "Aha!" said Pashka. "He came from past the sign." That was completely obvious, but Anton objected. "No way, he was going the other direction." Pashka raised his astonished eyes at him. "Have you gone blind?" "He was going the other direction," Anton repeated stubbornly. "Let's follow him." "That's ridiculous!" Pashka was outraged. "For one thing, no respectable driver would go the wrong way past a do not enter sign. For another, just look. Here's the pothole, here are the tracks of the brakes. So which way was he going?" "Who cares about respectable? I'm not respectable myself, and I'm going past the sign." Pashka exploded. "Do what you want," he said, stuttering slightly. "Moron! The heat's gone to your head!" Anton turned around and, staring fixedly in front of him, went past the sign. The only thing he wanted was to come across a blown-up bridge and to have to fight his way through to the other side. "What do I care about some respectable guy?" he thought. "They can do what they want. Anka and her Pashenka." He remembered how Anka had cut Pavel down when he called her Anechka, and he felt a bit better. He looked back. He saw Pashka right away, bon locusta, bent in two, following the receding tracks of the mysterious car. The rusty disc above the road swayed gently, and the blue sky flickered through the hole in the disc. And Anka was sitting by the roadside, her elbows propped on her knees and her chin on her clenched fists. On their way back, it was already dusk. The boys were rowing, and Anka was at the rudder. A red moon was rising over the black forest, and frogs were croaking incessantly. "We planned the outing so well," Anka said sadly. "You two." The boys were silent. Then Pashka asked quietly, "Toshka, what was there beyond the sign?" "A blown-up bridge," answered Anton. "And the skeleton of a fascist chained to a machine gun." He thought a moment and added, "The machine gun had sunk into the ground." Pashka said. "It happens. And guess what? I helped that guy fix his car." Chapter 1. When Rumata passed Holy Micha's grave, the seventh and last along the road, it was already completely dark. The much ballyhooed Hammaherian stallion, received from Don Tomeo in payment of a gambling debt, had turned out to be completely worthless. He had become sweaty and footsore, and moved in a wretched wobbly trot. Rumata dug his knees into the horse's sides and whipped him between the ears with a glove, but he only dejectedly shook his head without moving any faster. Bushes stretched alongside the road, resembling clouds of solidified smoke in the gloom. The whine of mosquitoes was intolerable. Scattered stars trembled dimly in the murky sky. A mild wind was blowing in gusts, warm and cold at the same time, as was always the case in autumn in this seaside country, with its dusty, muggy days and chilly nights. Rumata wrapped his cloak tighter and let go of his reins. He had no reason to hurry. There was still an hour until midnight, and the jagged black edge of the hiccup forest had already appeared above the horizon. Ploughed fields flanked the road. Swamps flickered beneath the stars, stinking of inorganic rust. Barrows and rotting palisades from the time of the invasion were visible in the dark. To his left, a grim glow was flaring up and dying down. A village must be burning, one of the innumerable indistinguishable places known as Deadtown, Gallowland, or Robberdale, though august decree had recently renamed them Beloved, Blessed, and Angelic. This country extended for hundreds of miles, from the shores of the Strait until the Saiva of the Hiccup Forest, blanketed with mosquito clouds, torn apart by ravines, drowning in swamps, stricken by fevers, plagues, and foul-smelling head colds. At the turn of the road, a dark figure materialized from the bushes. The stallion shied, throwing back his head. Rumata grabbed the reins, adjusted the lace on his right sleeve out of habit, and put his hand on the hilt of his sword before taking a good look. The figure took off his hat.
"Good evening, noble Don,"
he said quietly.
"I beg your pardon."
"What is it?" Rumata asked, listening hard. There's no such thing as a silent ambush. Robbers give themselves away by the creak of their bowstrings. The grey stormtroopers belch uncontrollably from the stale beer. The baronial militiamen breathe avidly through their noses and clatter their weapons, while the slave-hunting monks noisily scratch themselves. But the bushes were quiet. It seemed the man wasn't a bandit. Not that he looked much like a bandit. A short, thick-set city resident in a modest cloak.
"May I run alongside you?"
he asked, bowing. "Certainly," said Rumata, lifting the reins. "You may hold the stirrup." The man began to walk next to Rumata. His hat was in his hand, and a substantial bald patch shone on top of his head. Probably a steward, thought Rumata, visiting the barons and cattle dealers, buying flax or hemp. A brave steward, though. Maybe he isn't a steward. Maybe he's a bookworm, a fugitive, an outcast. There are a lot of them on the night roads nowadays, more than there are stewards. Or maybe he's a spy. "Who are you, and where are you from?" Rumata asked.
"My name is Kian,"
the man said sadly.
"I'm coming from Arkady."
"You're running away from Arkady," Rumata said, bending down.
"I'm running away,"
the man agreed sadly. Some eccentric, thought Rumata. Or maybe he really is a spy. I should test him. Actually, why should I? Who says I should? What right do I have to test him? No, I don't want to. Why can't I simply trust him? Here is a city dweller, clearly a bookworm, running for his life. He's lonely, he's scared, he's weak, he's looking for protection. He meets an aristocrat. Due to their arrogance and stupidity, aristocrats don't understand politics, but their swords are long and they don't like the greys. Why shouldn't Kian, the city dweller, benefit from the disinterested protection of a stupid and arrogant aristocrat? That's it. I won't test him. I have no reason to test him. We'll talk. Pass the time, part as friends. Kian. Rumata said. I knew a Kian once, a seller of potions and an alchemist from Tin Street. Are you a relative of his?
Unfortunately, I am, said Kian. Just a distant relative. But it's all the same to them, until the 12th generation.
And where are you running away to, Kian?
Somewhere. The farther the better. Lots of people run away to Irukan. I'll try Irukan too.
Well, well, Rumata said. And you think that the noble Don will help you across the border? Kian was quiet. Or maybe you think that the noble Don doesn't know who the alchemist Kian from Tin Street is? Kian stayed quiet. What am I saying? Thought Rumata. He stood up in his stirrups and shouted, imitating the town crier in the royal square. Accused and convicted of terrible, unforgivable crimes against God, peace, and the crown. Kian was quiet. And what if the noble Don adores Don Reba? What if he's wholeheartedly devoted to the grey world and the grey cause? Or do you think that's impossible? Kian was quiet. The jagged shadow of a gallows appeared out of the darkness to the right of the road. A naked body, strung up by its feet, shone white beneath the crossbeam. Bah! It's not even working, thought Rumata. He reined his horse in, grabbed Kian by the shoulder, and spun him around to face him. And what if the noble Don decides to string you up right next to this tramp? He said, peering into the white face with dark pits for eyes. All by myself, quickly and neatly. Why are you quiet, literate Kian? Kian was quiet. His teeth chattered, and he squirmed weakly in Rumata's grasp like a crushed lizard. Then something suddenly fell into the roadside ditch with a splash, and immediately, as if to drown out the splash, he shouted frantically, "Then hang me! Hang me, traitor!" Rumata took a deep breath and let Kian go. I was joking, he said. Don't be scared.
Lies, lies,
Kian mumbled, sobbing.
Lies everywhere.
Come on, don't be mad, Rumata said. You'd better pick up what you threw in, it'll get wet. Kian waited a bit, rocking in place and blubbering. Then he pointlessly patted his cloak with the palms of his hands and climbed into the ditch. Rumata waited, hunching wearily in his saddle. That's how it has to be, he thought. There's no other way. Kian climbed out of the ditch, hiding the bundle underneath his shirt. Books, of course, Rumata said. Kian shook his head.
No,
he murmured.
Just one book. My book.
And what are you writing about?
I'm afraid it wouldn't interest you, noble Don.
Rumata sighed. Take the stirrup, he said. Let's go. For a long time they were silent. Listen, Kian, said Rumata. I was joking. Don't be scared of me.
What a wonderful world,
Kian said.
What a merry world. Everybody jokes, and everybody's jokes are the same, even noble Rumata's.
Rumata was surprised. You know my name.
I do,
Kian said.
I recognized you by the circlet on your head. I was so glad to meet you on the road.
Ah, of course, that's what he meant when he called me a traitor, thought Rumata. He said, You see, I thought you were a spy. I always kill spies.
A spy,
repeated Kian.
Yes, of course. In our times it's so easy and rewarding to be a spy. Our eagle, the noble Don Reba, is interested in what the king's subjects say and think. I wish I could be a spy. A rank-and-file informer at the Greyjoy Inn. How lovely, how respectable. At 6 o'clock I come to the bar and sit down at my table. The proprietor rushes toward me with my first pint. I can drink however much I want. The beer is paid for by Don Reba, or rather, it isn't paid for at all. I sit there, sip my beer and listen. Sometimes I pretend to write down conversations, and the frightened little people hurry to me with offers of friendship and money. Their eyes express only the things I want. Dog-like devotion, fearful awe, and delightful, impotent hatred. I can grope girls with impunity and fondle wives in front of their husbands, big, burly men, and they'll only giggle obsequiously. What beautiful reasoning, noble Don, is it not? I heard it from a 15-year-old boy, a student of the patriotic school. And what did you tell him? Asked Rumata curiously. What could I tell him? He wouldn't have understood. So I told him when Wagger the Wheels men catch an informant, they rip his belly open and fill his insides with pepper. And drunken soldiers stuff the informant into a sack and drown him in an outhouse. And this was gospel truth, but he didn't believe me. He said that wasn't covered in school. Then I took out some paper and wrote down our conversation. I needed it for my book, but he, poor thing, decided that it was for a report, and he wet himself from fright. The lights of Skeleton Baco's inn flashed through the bushes ahead. Kian stumbled and went quiet. "What's wrong?" asked Rumata. "It's a grey patrol," muttered Kian. "So what?" said Rumata. "Listen to another bit of reasoning, worthy Kian. We love and value these simple rough boys, our grey fighting beasts. We need them. From now on, a commoner better keep his tongue in his mouth unless he wants it to dangle out on the gallows." He roared with laughter, because it was so well put, in the finest tradition of the grey barracks. Kian shuddered and drew his head into his shoulders. "A commoner's tongue should know its place. God gave the commoner a tongue not for making fine speeches, but for licking the boots of his master, who has been placed above him since time immemorial." The saddled horses of the grey patrol were tied to the hitching post in front of the tavern. Husky, avid swearing came through the open window. There was a clatter of dice. In the door, blocking the way with his monstrous belly, stood Skeleton Baco himself, in a ragged leather jacket with the sleeves rolled up. In his hairy paw was a cleaver. Clearly he had been chopping dog meat for the soup, gotten sweaty, and come out to catch his breath. A dejected-looking grey stormtrooper was sitting on the front steps, his battle-axe between his knees. The axe-handle was pulling his mug off to one side. He was clearly feeling the effects of drink. Noticing the rider, he pulled himself together and bellowed huskily, "Stop! Who goes there? You! Nobility!" Rumata, jutting out his chin, rode past without a single look. "And if a commoner's tongue licks the wrong boot," he said loudly, "then it should be removed altogether, for it is said, 'Thy tongue is my enemy.'" Kian, hiding behind the horse's croup, was taking long strides by his side. Out of the corner of his eye, Rumata saw his bald patch glistening with sweat. "I said stop!" roared the stormtrooper. They could hear him stumbling down the stairs, rattling his axe, cursing God, Satan, and those noble scum in one breath. About 5 men, thought Rumata. Drunk butchers. Piece of cake. They passed the inn and turned toward the forest. "I could walk faster if you like," Kian said in an unnaturally steady voice. "Nonsense," Rumata said, reining in his stallion. "It'd be dull to ride so far without a single fight. Don't you ever want to fight, Kian? It's all talk and talk." "No," said Kian. "I never want to fight." "That's just the trouble," Rumata muttered, turning the stallion around and slowly pulling on his gloves. 2 horsemen jumped out from beyond the bend, coming to a sudden halt when they saw him. "Hey you, noble Don!" one of them shouted. "Come on, show us your travelling papers." "Boors," Rumata said icily. "You're illiterate. What would you do with them?" He nudged his stallion with his knees and trotted toward the stormtroopers. "They're chickening out," he thought, hesitating. "Come on, at least a couple of blows." "No? No luck. How I'd like to let out some of the hatred that's accumulated over the past 24 hours, but it looks like I'll have no luck. Let us remain humane,
Forgive everyone and be calm like the gods. Let them slaughter and desecrate, we'll be calm like the gods. The gods need not hurry, they have eternity ahead. He rode right up to them. The stormtroopers raised their axes uncertainly and backed up. "Well?" said Rumata.
"What's this, eh?"
said the first stormtrooper in confusion.
"Is this the noble Don Rumata, eh?"
The second stormtrooper immediately turned his horse around and galloped away at full speed. The first one kept backing up, his axe lowered.
"Beg your pardon, noble Don,"
he was saying rapidly.
"Didn't recognize you. Just a mistake. Affairs of state. Mistakes do happen. The boys drank a bit much. They're burning with zeal."
He started to ride away sideways.
"As you know, it's a difficult time. We're hunting down fugitive literates. We wouldn't like you to be displeased with us, noble Don."
Rumata turned his back to him.
"Have a good journey, noble Don,"
said the stormtrooper with relief. When he left, Rumata called softly, "Kian?" No one answered.
"Hey, Kian!"
And again no one answered. Listening carefully, Rumata could make out the rustling of bushes through the whine of the mosquitoes. Kian was hurrying west through the fields, toward the border with Irukan. And that's that, thought Rumata. That's it for that conversation. That's how it always is. A careful probing, a wary exchange of cryptic parables. Whole weeks are wasted in trite chatter with all sorts of scum, but when you meet a real man, there's no time to talk. You have to protect him, save him, send him out of danger, and he leaves you without even knowing whether he was dealing with a friend or a capricious ass. And you don't learn much about him either. His wishes, his talents, what he lives for. He thought of Arkady in the evening, the solid stone houses on the main streets, the friendly lantern above the entrance to the tavern, the complacent, well-fed shopkeepers drinking beer at clean tables and arguing that the world isn't bad at all. The price of bread is falling, the price of armor is rising. Conspiracies are quickly discovered, sorcerers and suspicious bookworms are hanged on the gallows, the king is as usual great and wise, while Don Reba is infinitely clever and always on his guard.
The things they come up with. The world is round. For all I care, it's square. Just don't stir things up. Literacy. Literacy is the source of it all, my brothers. First they tell us money can't buy happiness, then they say peasants are people too, and it only gets worse. Offensive verses, then rioting. Hang them all, my brothers. You know what I'd do? I'd ask them straight out. Can you read? Off to the gallows. Write verses? Off to the gallows. Know your multiplication tables? Off to the gallows, you know too much. Beena, honey. 3 more pints and a serving of rabbit stew.
Meanwhile, squat, red-faced young men with heavy axes on their right shoulders pound the cobblestones, thump, 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 with their hobnailed boots.
My brothers, here they come, our defenders. Would they let it happen? Not on your life. And my boy, he's on the right flank. Seems like only yesterday I was flogging him. Yes, my brothers, these are no troubled times. The throne is strong, prosperity reigns, there's inviolable peace and justice. Hooray for the grey troops! Hooray for Don Reba! Glory to the king! Oh, my brothers, how wonderful life has become!
Meanwhile, the roads and trails of the dark plains of the kingdom of Arkady, lit by the glows of fires and the sparks of torches, are filled with hundreds of wretches running, walking, stumbling, avoiding outposts. They are tormented by mosquitoes, covered in sweat and dust, exhausted, frightened, and desperate, yet hard as steel in their convictions. They've been declared outside the law because they are able and willing to heal and teach their sick and ignorant race, because they, like the gods, use clay and stone to create another reality to beautify the life of a race that knows no beauty, because they penetrate the secrets of nature, hoping to put these secrets in the service of their inept race, which is still cowed by ancient superstitions, helpless, kind, impractical, far ahead of their time. Rumata pulled off his glove and whipped his stallion hard between the ears. "Giddy up, lazybones," he said in Russian. It was already midnight when he entered the forest. No one was quite sure where the strange name came from, the Hiccup Forest. The official version was that 300 years ago, the troops of Imperial Marshal Tots, later the first king of Arkana, were hacking their way through the Saiva, pursuing the retreating hordes of copper-skinned barbarians, and during rest stops they boiled white tree bark to make a brew that caused uncontrollable hiccups. According to this legend, one day Marshal Tots was making the rounds of the camp and, wrinkling his aristocratic nose, declared, "This is truly insupportable. The whole forest has hiccups and reeks of homebrew." And this was allegedly the source of the strange name. In any case, it wasn't quite an ordinary forest. It was full of gigantic trees with hard white trunks, which no longer existed elsewhere in the empire, not in the Duchy of Irukan, and definitely not in the Mercantile Republic of Soan, which had long since used up its timber on ships. It was said that there were many such forests beyond the North Red Ridge in the country of the barbarians, but lots of tales were told about the country of the barbarians. A road had been cut through the forest 2 centuries ago. It led to the silver mines, and by feudal right belonged to the Barons Pampa, descendants of one of the companions of Marshal Tots. This feudal right cost the kings of Arkana 12 pounds of pure silver per year, and therefore each successive king, after ascending the throne, gathered an army and went to war with Castle Bow, the seat of the barons. The castle walls were strong, the barons were brave, and each campaign cost 30 pounds of silver. After the return of the defeated army, the king of Arkana would once again confirm the feudal right of the barons Pampa, along with their other privileges, picking their noses at the royal table, hunting to the west of Arkana, and calling princes only by their names, without adding titles and ranks. The Hiccup Forest was full of dark secrets. During the day, wagons of processed ore trundled south along the road, and at night the road was empty, because few men were brave enough to walk it by starlight. It was said that at night the Sioux bird, a bird that has never been seen and cannot be seen since it is no ordinary bird, cried out from the father tree. It was said that huge hairy spiders jumped out of the branches onto the necks of horses and instantly gnawed through their veins, drowning in blood. It was said that the ancient beast Pake roamed the forest, a creature covered in scales that sired offspring every 12 years and dragged behind him 12 tails oozing poisonous sweat. And someone had seen the naked boar Y, cursed by the holy Micha, crossing the road in broad daylight, grumbling plaintively, a ferocious animal, invulnerable to iron but easily pierced by bone. Here you could also meet a runaway slave with a tar brand between his shoulder blades, silent and ruthless like the hairy blood-sucking spider, or a stooped warlock, collecting secret mushrooms for his magic potions, which could be used to become invisible, turn into various animals, or acquire a second shadow. The night sentries of the fearsome Wagger the Wheel also walked this road, as did the fugitives from the silver mines with their black hands and white transparent faces. Medicine men gathered here for their nightly vigils, and Baron Pampa's rowdy huntsmen would skewer stolen oxen and roast them whole in the scattered clearings. In the depths of the forest, a mile away from the road, beneath an enormous tree that had dried up of old age, stood a lopsided hut made out of enormous logs, surrounded by a blackened picket fence. It had been here since the beginning of time. Its door was always shut, and there were crooked idols carved from whole tree trunks around its rotting porch. This hut was the most dangerous place in the Hiccup Forest. It was said that this was the very place to which the ancient Pake would come every 12 years to deliver his offspring, after which he would immediately crawl beneath the hut and expire. So the hut's entire cellar was filled with black poison, and when the poison seeped out, that's when the end would come. It was said that on stormy nights the idols dug themselves out of the ground, came out onto the road, and signalled to passers-by. And it was also said that sometimes the windows shone with unnatural light. Sounds resounded through the forest, and a column of smoke reached up from the chimney to the sky. Not long ago, Irma Kukish, a sober simpleton from the farmstead of Plenitude, in common parlance, Stinkfield, foolishly wandered by the hut at night and peered into the windows. He came home completely incoherent, and after he recovered a little, said that the hut was full of bright light, and that a man with his feet on the bench sat behind a crude table and guzzled from a barrel held in one hand. The man's face hung all the way down to his waist, and was spotted all over. It was obvious that this was the holy Mitya himself, before his conversion to the faith, a polygamist, drunkard, and blasphemer. To look at him was to be afraid. A sickly sweet smell wafted out the window, and shadows moved across the trees. People gathered from all over to hear the idiot's story, and it all ended when the stormtroopers came, bent his elbows to his shoulder-blades, and hustled him off to the city of Arkady. But people still talked about the hut, and it was now called nothing but the Drunken Lair. Rumata made his way through the thicket of giant ferns, dismounted by the Drunken Lair's porch, and wound his reins around one of the idols. The hut was fully lit, the door open and hanging by a hinge, and Father Kabani was sitting behind the table in a state of utter dejection. The room was filled with a powerful odour of spirits, and a huge stein towered on the table between the gnawed bones and pieces of boiled turnips. "Good evening, Father Kabani," Rumata said, stepping over the threshold.
"Greetings,"
Father Kabani answered, in a raspy voice that sounded like a battle horn. Rumata came up to the table, spurs jingling. He threw his gloves on the bench and took another look at Father Kabani. Father Kabani was motionless, supporting his drooping face with his hand. His shaggy, greying eyebrows hung down over his cheeks like dry grass over a cliff. With every breath, the nostrils of his coarsely poured nose whistled out air saturated with undigested alcohol.
"I invented it myself,"
he said suddenly, raising his right eyebrow with effort and turning a puffy eye towards Rumata.
"I did it myself. Why did I do it?"
He extracted his right hand from underneath his cheek and shook a hairy finger.
"But it's not my fault. I invented it, and it's not my fault, eh? That's right. Not my fault. Anyway, we don't invent a thing, that's all nonsense."
Rumata unbuckled his belt and pulled his swords off over his head. Now, he said.
"The box!"
barked Father Kabani, and stayed silent for a long time, making strange motions with his cheeks. Rumata, without taking his eyes off him, threw his dusty-booted feet over the bench and sat, putting his swords down nearby.
"The box,"
Father Kabani repeated in a deflated voice.
"We only say we invent things. Actually, it was all invented a long time ago, Someone invented it all, stuck it in a box, made a hole in the lid, and left. Left to go to sleep. Then what? Father Kabani comes in, closes his eyes, shoves his hand into the hole."
Father Kabani looked at his hand.
He grabs it. "Ha! An invention! This thing here is my invention," he says, "and if you don't believe it, you're a fool." I shove my hand in. That's the one. What is it? Barbed wire. What's it for? Protecting farmyards from the wolves. I shove my hand in. That's two. What is it? The handiest thing? A meat grinder. What's it for? Tender minced meat. Good job. I shove my hand in. That's 3. What is it? Flammable water. What's it for? Kindling damp wood, eh?
Father Kabani went quiet and began to slump, as if someone had grabbed his neck and was pushing him forward. Rumata picked up the stein, looked inside, then poured a few drops onto the back of his hand. The drops were purple and smelled of fusel oil. Rumata carefully wiped his hand with a lace handkerchief. Oil stains appeared on it. Father Kabani's shaggy head touched the table and immediately jerked up.
The man who put it in the box, he knew what it was all for. Barbed wire for the wolves? How silly of me. For the wolves! The mines should be ringed with this wire so state criminals can't escape. And I don't want that. I'm a state criminal myself. Did they ask me? Sure they did. Barbed wire, they said. Barbed wire. For the wolves, they said. For the wolves. Well done, they said. Good job. We'll use it to ring the mines. Don Raber did it himself. And he took my meat grinder. Good job, he said. What a mind you've got, he said. So now the merry tower makes tender minced meat. Very effective, they say.
I know, thought Rumata. I know all about this. And how you yelled in Don Raber's office, how you begged and grovelled at his feet. Give it back, don't do it, it was too late. Your meat grinder had started turning. Father Kabani grabbed the stein and put it to his hairy maw. Gulping down the poisonous brew, he roared like the boar. Why? Then he shoved the stein onto the table and started to chew on a piece of turnip. Tears crept down his cheeks.
Flammable water,
he finally announced in a strangled voice.
For kindling fires and merry magic tricks. What does it matter that it's flammable if you can drink it? Mix it with beer. What a beer you get. I won't allow it. I'll drink it myself. And I drink it. All day long I drink it. All night long I'm all swollen. I fall down all the time. The other day, Don Rumata, you won't believe it, I was near a mirror, and I got scared. I look. Lord help me. Where's Father Kabani? A sea creature like an octopus with coloured spots all over. First red spots, then blue spots. That's what comes of inventing water for magic tricks.
Father Kabani tried to spit on the floor, but hit the table instead, then shuffled his feet beneath the bench out of habit, as if rubbing it into the dirt. He suddenly asked,
What day is it today?
The eve of Kata the Pious, said Rumata.
And why is there no sun?
Because it's night.
Night again,
Father Kabani said dejectedly, and fell face first into the table scraps. Rumata looked at him for a while, whistling through his teeth. Then he stood up from the table and went into the pantry. There, between the heap of turnips and the heap of sawdust, gleamed the glass tubes of Father Kabani's massive brewing apparatus, an amazing creation of a born engineer, natural chemist, and master glassblower. Rumata circled the infernal machine twice, then felt for a crowbar in the dark and swung hard at it, aiming nowhere in particular. Clanking, jingling, gurgling sounds filled the pantry. The nauseating smell of sour homebrew assaulted his nostrils. Broken glass crunching beneath his heels, Rumata made his way into a far corner and turned on an electric lamp. There, underneath a pile of trash, was the compact field synthesizer Midas in its strong silicate safe. Rumata cleared away the trash, entered in the code, and lifted the lid of the safe. Even in the white electric light, the synthesizer looked peculiar in the midst of the scattered junk. Rumata dumped a few shovels of sawdust into the receiving funnel, and the synthesizer began to hum quietly, its display panel turning on automatically. Rumata shoved a rusty bucket underneath the output chute with the toe of his boot, and immediately, clink, 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 gold discs with the aristocratic profile of Pitts VI, King of Arkana, started pouring onto its battered tin bottom.